Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome. My name is Adam Smith. I'm the entrepreneur in residence and senior lecturer at the University of Aberdeen Business School. Today, I'm delighted to welcome so many of you to our second In Conversation With event. On the first Wednesday of every month, the Business School will host conversations with business leaders on topics including sustainability, entrepreneurship, and energy transition. We are exceedingly excited to be virtually joined today by so many alumni, students, business leaders, and colleagues. Just a point to remind you that this event is being recorded, and we would like to encourage you to join our conversation. So please feel free to ask any questions using the question and answer box. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Professor Gary McEwan, who to discuss what can your business learn from startups? So Gary, welcome. Can I ask you please to introduce yourself and tell us a little about yourself?
Sure, and thank you, Adam, for the opportunity, and good morning, everybody. I'm sure you're all having your morning coffee like me. So I'm Gary. As you mentioned, I'm Professor of Entrepreneurship at the University of Aberdeen and also the University of Dundee, but my main job, I would suspect, is running an organisation called Elevator. For those who live in Dundee or Aberdeen, I would hope that would be a familiar name. So that organisation is really all about supporting people who are entrepreneurially minded, either to take those first early steps into entrepreneurship, or in fact grow their business if they've managed to get good traction and have that desire to grow, because not all do. We do that over quite a big geography, though. We pretty much cover most of Scotland. We have over 100 employees across 26 offices, so we support somewhere in the order of 4,000 businesses each year. So it's quite a large scale, but our determination really is to make Scotland a more entrepreneurial place, to make our economy as vibrant as it can possibly be, and entrepreneurs are really, to me, are at the heart of that process of creating new wealth within our country. But my background is very much entrepreneurial as opposed to academic, because I don't have a strong educational background. I was kind of straight from school into my early businesses, which were, in sum total, pretty much a disaster until, I got to my mid-20s and kind of got the hang of it then. And so it's been a journey of entrepreneurship for me, one that's been a bit of a roller coaster. But I've learned
Excellent.
a lot.
And apologies, sorry, I dropped out for a sec.
That's okay, you can carry on.
Sorry, reading through your profile, I saw one of your first business was selling dog food door to door, and so it sort of prompted me to want to ask you, when did you first start thinking of yourself as an entrepreneur?
I think my earliest recollections really were probably not about being an entrepreneur, because I wouldn't have known what an entrepreneur was when I was very young. But what I was aware of, because my father was an entrepreneur, not an overly successful one, I hasten to add. He was like me in the early stages. He tried a lot, and I watched and understood early on that my family sometimes had money, sometimes didn't, and that was a direct kind of mirror image of how well my dad was doing or not at that point. So I understood that it wasn't an entirely financially stable environment to be, in my early stages. But even as an individual, I knew what it was like to have money. I remember being able to buy sweets or toys if I had money, and I couldn't if I didn't. And so I realised that, I suppose, that value of money very early on through my dad. But I was up to kind of entrepreneurial tricks from a very early age, So from 5 or 6 years old, I was doing things that would make me money. I guess I was being an entrepreneur, but I wasn't aware I was being an entrepreneur. I just wanted to have some pennies in my pocket. But all through my education, I don't know that I entirely bought into my educational opportunity, because I was really eager to learn. So I wasn't an anti-learner. It's just that the ability to kind of absorb information that was being taught, to retain it and then recycle it in an exam on a subject that I had very little interest in, that didn't do anything for me at all. I wanted to learn, but I wanted to learn and absorb the things that I wanted to learn and absorb. And so my relationship with education was sketchy, Adam, I would say, at the best.
And you talk about having that trait of being able to, that eagerness to learn. Are there any other traits that you think have stood well with you as an entrepreneur that you can share with the group?
Well, I think entrepreneurs are a very different bunch, and I don't think that they form into one type. You get lots of different people can be entrepreneurs. I don't think it's a uniqueness, but for me personally, maybe a question better asked of those I work with, because they would maybe see these traits more than I might. But I find that one common trait amongst entrepreneurs is they're very determined and sort of single-minded people. They can quite often be seen as, when everybody's marching in one direction, they're marching in the opposite direction. And that's a good thing in an entrepreneur, except it can be a bad thing when you begin to grow the business, because you can't grow the business without being able to work with other people. You can't grow a business without building a team. And if you're constantly marching in the opposite direction as a kind of lone wolf, it's enormously difficult to work with people. But I found it quite easy. I enjoy working within a team. I enjoy trying to pull that team together and making them part of the journey that we're all on. And so that's a trait that I think has worked well for me. I suppose I mentioned earlier on that life as an entrepreneur is a bit of a roller coaster. It's not plain sailing all the time. You're up and down. You have incredible highs, but you also have some low moments as well. And I'm someone who quite likes to try and bring some sort of sense and order to that craziness. So I find that quite a challenge, but I absolutely love the challenge of leadership under those kind of circumstances when situations are often quite ambiguous or uncertain. I like being able to face up to the challenge of leading people who are uncomfortable in that environment through that process, because I've been through that roller coaster so many times now. If I could add one third small one, Adam, because I think it might be, I was incredibly naive as a young entrepreneur. In fact, most entrepreneurs are very naive in the beginning. And I actually look back on that as being quite a strength. It's not always to your disadvantage to be naive, because it gives you a sense of bravery, I suppose, that see if we knew what was ahead of us when we start a business, if we knew what was coming, I'm not sure many would embark on it. So sometimes naivety is a wee bit of a protection, because it allows you just to deal with what's in front of you now and get to the end of the process. Whereas if you look at it on the round, you would end up saying, well, I don't think I'm up for that. So naivety, I don't think we should all acknowledge it, but I don't think we should all just assume that it's the worst trait to have sometimes.
Excellent, really interesting. And you mentioned leadership, and so in terms of looking at what you've done with your career, how did you learn to scale a business through using that leadership?
Yeah, I think it's to be able to grow or scale a business. It definitely requires a different set of skills than the ones you really need to get a business up and running in the first place. In the early stages of a business, entrepreneurs are kind of feeling their way into it. That they're making small mistakes, they're correcting them, and they're learning as they go. One thing that's very difficult to teach someone is that ignition point of how they come up with the idea in the first place. That's not an easy thing to teach. It's not an easy thing to get people to buy into their own vision. That's something that I think is quite natural within our entrepreneurs, to see an opportunity and have the desire to sort of exploit it. But the ongoing process, once you've started and you want to start to grow the business, I absolutely believe that bit can be taught, and you can learn mostly from other people who have done that. Because I do remember I was probably 3 or 4 small businesses into my entrepreneurial life. I had lots of small businesses when I left school, and I mostly started them with very little and kind of ended up with very little. But I was learning all the time. But I remember my dad, who was the sort of quintessential trier, if you like. One bit of advice he gave me was, he said, remember, Gary, it's good to learn from your mistakes, because I'd made lots. He says, but try not to get all your education that way. There's so much to learn from other people. Why don't you ask the question? And I do think that is the secret, to growing, is actually to have a few co-pilots who have done it before and who you can learn from. Because I think on reflection, that's mostly what I've done is copy the best examples of how I can learn and develop from others. But the process of scaling and growing the business, that's got a lot more kind of structure around it, a lot more rigor around it than the early stages. It's not an easy process, but it's something you can absolutely learn. But the question really, I think most people need to ask themselves is just whether that metamorphosis that needs to happen with you as an individual. You may just want to stay as a small business because you just don't have the inclination to be metamorphosizing into something that you need to have to be able to grow that business. Quite different things, and so it's a decision to learn, and also to learn and develop as an individual.
It's really great advice about learning from your own mistakes. I think it was Steve Jobs that said it's great to learn from your mistakes. It's even better to learn from other people's mistakes. And you're right, you don't want to get all your education from it. That's great. Staying on leadership, I'm just interested if you could share with us how you share your vision for your businesses with your team.
Yeah, I think the having that vision, that clarity, is one of the fundamental requirements of leadership, probably, but especially entrepreneurial leadership, which I think is quite a distinct sort of subset of leadership. But to me, the very essence of proper entrepreneurial leadership is having that ability to authentically, and I think that's really important, authentically deliver that clear vision to your team. It's very difficult to sort of blow an uncertain trumpet. You've got to be absolutely laser focused and crystal clear about what it is that you are trying to achieve, and be able to get that across authentically. In terms of sharing it, my own personal methodology, Adam, involves, I'm quite reflective, so I will have an idea about where I see opportunity, where I want to go. So I'll ponder it until I mature it to a certain point where I'm happy to share it. I then tend to share it with 2 or 3 people who I trust 100%. My very close inner circle of colleagues, the ones that will then shape it and help me take the edges off it that I didn't see. And I'll gradually widen that vision out. So by the time it reaches the wider team, it's well thought out, and because I'm never confident that the way that I see it is absolutely the way it should be. So I do take counsel, and I widen it out on a slow basis. I'm not the kind of person who comes up with a single-minded thing, stands up on a soapbox and just says, this is what's going to happen. I tend to do it through kind of osmosis. But I didn't always find that easy, Adam. As the company grows and you get more people involved, and you get people less intimately, it can feel sometimes. I didn't always feel absolutely comfortable being the one person to stand up and say, here's that clarity of vision, because I guess because of where I began life, I didn't know that I was absolutely qualified to do that. But somebody then said to me, it's quite hard to lead from the front if you think you look funny on a horse. And it was absolutely true. And nobody else thinks you look funny on a horse, because they're all looking to you for that leadership. But you need to get comfortable with that. And once you do get comfortable with it, then you can have much more sharp vision that you can share with people. But even when you do, there's definitely in all my years, I've never quite got over the rule of thirds. You deliver that vision, and a third of the people you're speaking to are totally bought into it. A third kind of get it, and a third probably couldn't care less. And they're there for different reasons. And so trying to optimize that, you just never get it, so that everybody is, with you on that journey.
And you've mentioned two distinct groups there within your business: your close inner circle and your larger, the larger team that you may not be able to have as close a relationship. I'm interested if you could share with us a couple of insights about how you feel is the best way to build the right team around you.
Yeah, it's a fatal error, I think, and it's a lot of businesses have come to grief just on this one point, that their inability to build a team around about them that they can trust and rely on, and get it right. And you don't always get it right first time. You don't always get it right every time, because it's not an exact science. I might actually come back to that. But if somebody was to say to me, what's the main constraining factor about growing your business, I would say, well, there's three. There's talent, and talent. It's the ability to access talent, which is actually, to me, that's the ignition point for growth if you've got the right people around you. So I think, first of all, you have to choose the kind of culture you're trying to create in the business, and then hire people that first of all meet that cultural profile, because if they don't, then the machine will seize up eventually. Because it's that culture, to me, is what is the oil in the machine. And so somebody who's culturally wrong for the business but performs highly is still going to seize the machine up. So culture is hugely important, and getting the right people that can buy into that. But also, I probably oversimplify this, but when I look at teams, I always consider teams to either contain A players, B players, or C players. My organisation, you hear me talking about this all the time. My A players are the people who I would be devastated to lose. Those are the people who drive the organisation. The B players are hard-working, solid, reliable deliverers. But every business has C players, people who, if they're left the business tomorrow, they're eminently replaceable. They're not high flyers, and so trying to optimize always and have at worst B players. You need Bs and As, and trying to get everybody to perform optimally is one thing I learned probably the hard way on that. Was when we hired wrongly or badly, what I'd done is allow a B player to recruit people. Because B players tend to either, at best, recruit other Bs the same as them, or Cs. But they would very rarely recruit As because they would outshine them. So in our organisation now, if you're not an A player, you don't get to recruit people, because A players hire A players. That's who they like to work with, high-performing individuals. So that's a good learning point, I think, is to build a team, you need to have as many A players around as you possibly can. But it's not an exact science, as I mentioned earlier on. It's if it was, it would be easy, Adam. In fact, all the best leaders would probably be mathematicians if there was an algorithm for this. But it's not. It's feel, it's culture, it's values, it's getting people to fit in, it's getting up to optimize performance. Secret to growth.
Kevin in the chat has posted a really good question here, and if we can dig a little bit deeper, when you mentioned this inner circle, these closest one or two people that you have, how did you seek them out, or how did that come about? And is there any trait or anything unique about that relationship that allows you to have that kind of relationship with them?
Well, if there's one thing that's unique to it, it's trust. It's 100% trust. So I have that inner circle would contain some of the members of my senior management team, but it would also contain an equal amount of people who are not even in our organisation, people who take a very different view of life, people who will be completely and utterly honest with you, because once you're the CEO, you don't always get honest responses. You get what people think you want to hear, but you kind of got to cut through that and try and find people who will support and mentor you, no matter what level you're at. And you find them, it's difficult. In our business accelerators, we've tried to to manufacture circumstances that allow mentors to meet people who they can mentor. And sometimes it works, but often it just can't, because it's not that exact science. It's not mathematics. You can't look at two sets of qualities or whatever and say that'll be a great match. It's a bit like you might find somewhere a great match in a dating agency site and then meet them for a drink and within 30 seconds realise they're completely wrong for you. It's just pure chemistry. But if you find such a person who speaks sense, who can understand your challenges and who's been there before, grab them with both arms and don't let them go, and give back to them as well. But again, I think most of the great leaders that I have ever come across they're not ashamed to say it, they have mentors who support their development. So it's super important, but it's also very difficult because it's not an equation. But it could be somebody from a completely different world from you, just somebody that you trust their judgment. I hope that helps whoever asked the question.
Yeah, that's great. We've got another question coming up in the chat, and I think this is a really, really good one, and you couldn't be asking a better person. So Gary, the question is, this person is working as a business developer at a startup. What advice do you have for building partnerships with clients who might just think you're a typical salesperson?
Yeah, it's I've often been told that I'm quite a good salesperson, but if you ask me, I would say I'm a terrible salesperson, because I'm quite introverted when it comes to. I don't like salesmen seem to have a knack of being able to just ask for business, which I always find really clunky and doesn't come naturally to me. I am more authentic than that. So to me, the sales process, I'm quite good at it, I think, and it's because I base it around building a relationship with people. That's how we get business, because I have good relationships. So if I happen to spend some time with a prospective client, be it on a golf course or whatever we happen to be doing, I will never talk about business during that unless they raise it. To me, I'll spend that time getting to know them, and it's amazing what business flows once you start to get to know them. But you have to do it. You have to be authentic about it. People see through salesmen, and there's a barrier at the beginning. As soon as you introduce yourself, they're thinking, here we go, it's going to be a typical sales pitch. So you need to catch them off guard by not being that way. Take a bit more time and care over that relationship and turn it into a sales relationship. Otherwise, you're just a snake oil salesman like everybody else. So you need to be different. Sometimes it's good to be naive around sales and just say, I want to get to know this person. The sales will flow after that. People will buy from the people they like. Simple.
Yeah, good advice. Excellent. I've got so many questions to ask, Aaron. I'm conscious of time, but I think one that's sort of been relevant to everyone, this collective experience with very challenging year. What part of COVID do you think has presented us with opportunity?
Yeah, COVID has been pretty devastating for a lot of businesses. There's no question about it. I don't think that's the question you're asking, though. You're asking about because in adversity, as we know, lies opportunity, and I think that is very true now. And a business that begins to trade has got a tough job on its hands, because whatever it's doing, it's going to try and displace somebody who's already doing it. Okay, so you're having to fight your way into a supply chain that's already there. Okay, and they're quite happy about it, their supply chain. And when you try and break into it, it doesn't please everyone, because when you displace somebody, they'll fight back, and you end up in trying to elbow your way into supply chains to try and become part of the scene, if you like. Unless you're coming up with something that is brand new, which there are no competitors for, but that's like hen's teeth. They're very, very rare, those situations. What COVID has done, though, is it's really shaken things up over the last year and a bit. That kind of disruption has been happening in markets. The supply chains have been quite disrupted. Players have fallen out of the market. They've changed direction. And so I don't think it's ever been easier than now to find your way back into that, into new markets. And so there's new gaps have appeared where there wasn't gaps before. And the ability of the entrepreneur to now exploit that is a good one. So yeah, I think this is a good time to be looking for opportunity, because there's plenty of opportunity around.
And given the topic for today was what can we learn from startups, are there a couple of points that you could give to our audience about what you think they can take away and what we can learn from startups?
Probably we've talked a lot today, Adam, about the difference between a startup and a growing company, because it's a different phase of the development. And I think in the startup phase, it's all about being really inventive, being really creative, working hard, but having your antenna up always for opportunities. And you get time to do that in the startup phase. The problem is that once a startup begins to grow, it has to develop a whole new set of skills. It has to think strategically. It has to build a team that can deliver way more than you can as an individual, to bring structure and rigor and process to the business. And it has to transition into becoming a kind of high-performing operation. And that's not a journey that's for everyone, Adam. It's because it's tough and it requires a whole lot of effort. The trouble begins, I think, when a growing business starts to do all the new things it needs to do, but forgets the things that got it there in the first place. So, the business starts to grow, and then suddenly it ceases to become inventive. It ceases to become creative, and its antenna drops, and it's not tuned into its environment anymore. And if the larger business as it grows forgets that stuff, then startups will get the jump on them. There's no question about it, because they're ready and waiting to exploit that opportunity, because startups see things differently. They're fearless, and you would ignore them at your peril. So I think the trick is the business grows, it's to acquire new skills, but not at the expense of the old ones. It's in addition to the old ones, and become that sort of complete entrepreneur.
Excellent. So we've got a question in the chat here from Simon asking, how did you come up with the name or the brand Elevator? He says it seems very apt to helping businesses grow.
Yeah, it was a decision we made in 2013. We built our Centre for Entrepreneurship in Aberdeen, which I hope everybody has seen, or they should, because it's a pretty cool place. But we had a very old-fashioned name. We were Enterprise North East Trust, which isn't a great name because it was very confusing to people, and it was quite geographically bound, and we had aspirations to grow across the country. So we sought guidance. An organisation in Glasgow called Graven. They designed our premises, but they also have a department that looks at branding. And the day that they talked about chucking everything we had ever, Enterprise North East Trust was a 20-year-old brand, and they wanted to rip it out and put Elevator in, and I did recoil from it slightly, but they said to me at the time, you've spent 20 years building a brand which is kind of rubbish. We guarantee that within 2 years, this brand will be better known than that brand ever was. It didn't even take 2 years. The brand became, I don't know how, we actually lost a board member over this. I remember he recounted, was it the post office or Royal Mail had rebranded to Consignia, spent a lot of money doing it, and it was an utter disaster. They went back to being either Post Office or Royal Mail, can't remember which. And he resigned because he thought it was such a bad mistake to change that brand. But we went with it, and it was the best thing we ever did, because it became really well known really quickly. And so it was a bold step, and one I didn't take lightly, but I'm glad we did.
Excellent. It's a great brand. It's sort of a big question that I've been keen to ask you is around your incubators and accelerators, that how you see how they will still work in a post-COVID world.
Well, we've had evidence of how they've worked in a COVID world, because we currently run 10 accelerators. We don't really have incubators as such. It depends on how you define these things, Adam. To me, they all work as long as there's a level of education or learning within them. That's the important thing. A place where a startup can go and sit and that's all that happens is they sit there and they work. That's not really going to add value. So we just tend to focus on acceleration, which is a process by which you learn an awful lot very quickly about how to get traction, how to grow the company. So we're currently running 10 accelerators across the country on all different sector types and also some general ones. We're currently, in fact, I think it's just about to start the academic accelerator within Aberdeen University is about to start, I think on Monday. But the education that happens within an accelerator, 12 weeks normally, people will get an Ivy League quality of education on how you start and scale a company during that time. That it would take them years to learn that if they do it as they go. And so I think what we've learned, over the last year is that people will want to consume information differently. So we've been able to do it virtually to great success and actually have much more people involved in it from far and wide. But the need for interaction on a one-to-one personal level hasn't gone away. So as soon as we can do that, I think that adds a huge amount of value. So I think the need to educate yourself will never go away. So that the need for an accelerator will always be there. Maybe how we deliver it, combining kind of virtual stuff and actual face-to-face, that will definitely change for the better, I think. But the most important thing is that people recognise the important lessons that they can learn by mixing with other people of a similar stage in their business and be taught in a way that they can avoid all the mistakes that I made along the way, which are many. So that in itself is a reason to get involved in these things.
Excellent. Well, unfortunately, I'm going to need to bring this event to a close. Thank you, Gary, for sharing your entrepreneurial story. Thank you to everyone who's joined us. Hope to see you at our next event of the series in conversation with Dee Bleakley on motivation, the 3 truths and a lie, and that's on Wednesday, the 7th of July. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Gary. Have a great week.
Bye.